we know everybody's time is valuable, so we want to make sure that we have a good use of your time and respect your participation today. There are basically three things that we want to try and cover today for you. One is to make this as educational as possible. Secondly, to assure that we provide immediate value. And lastly, that we make it an interactive session. So please make sure that if you have questions, you take time to ask them and to bring them forward. We'll do everything we can to answer them. We're going to try and do everything we can to assure that this is not a marketing event or a sales event, but something that you can use in your day-to-day practice around cybersecurity. The objectives today are really three. First and foremost is we want to help you when it comes to security operations centers to learn from some of the things that we have learned and avoid pitfalls when you either decide to partner with somebody or design and develop your own security operations center. The second thing is to help you identify some high-level evaluation criteria. Given the limited time we have today, we're not going to be able to go deep into evaluation criteria, but we'll hopefully give you enough things to think about that, again, you can avoid some pitfalls and start off on the right foot. Or if you already have a security operations center, maybe think about doing some self-reflection and seeing if any of the things that we've learned or that we highlight are applicable to what you're doing, and then certainly hopefully take some action to think through how to deal with that and address those issues. So with that, I'm going to give you a short little background on Sensato for those of you that don't know who we are or what we do. Promise not to make it too long. I'm very excited to get into the actual meat of the presentation and hopefully interact with you guys and hear from you in terms of what you've learned or what you've seen or what your concerns are. Sensato started back in 2013, specifically focused on healthcare and critical systems. And we continue to do that today. We primarily focus on healthcare information technology, but we also work across other areas that are defined by Department of Homeland Security as critical infrastructure. It doesn't mean we don't work with other organizations that fall outside that definition, but that is our primary focus and one of the reasons we have the perspective and the opinions that we have when it comes to cybersecurity. We've grown pretty rapidly over the past few years. We've been named twice top 500 most innovative security firms in the world. And we have also been named in 2016 the Frost & Sullivan Cybersecurity Visionary Leader. In 2017, last year, we introduced something called the Cybersecurity Tactical Training Center, which has a focus on doing advanced training and simulation. And so that's kind of our lineage and where we kind of came from and how we started. Today, there's basically three areas that we provide solutions across: advisory services, including incident response planning, pen testing, from basic all the way up through red team across the different venues. We do vulnerability assessments, including critical infrastructure systems and physical penetration and assessments. We also work we are releasing in the coming weeks to months a cyber range, which will allow participants to not only do test tabletop simulations, but to also actually encounter real attacks and see how those attacks would play out if you actually went through them. We realized about a year ago that right now, in many cases, the only way really to get an understanding of what would happen in a real attack is to actually be attacked. And we feel that that's not a really good answer for the industry. So working very hard to kind of get this cyber range pushed out and give people a forum where they can either go or we can come to them and they can experience real attacks in a controlled environment and help develop and sharpen and evolve their skill set. And we do a lot around medical device security. We also do things with autonomous vehicles and a bunch of other device stuff, but won't get into that right now. We have a security operations center, and that security operations center is called a CTOC. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a good bulk of the things that we're going to discuss with you today come from the lessons we learned in going through and developing and building out that SOC. We also offer a product called Sensato Nightingale, which is a honeypot breach detection system. It also has forensic collection capabilities that we're introducing, as well as automated countermeasures. And we'd be happy to talk to you about anything we do, but really want to kind of focus on helping educate and spread information rather than market to you. I will say there are basically three things that I think make us different. For those of you that know us, hopefully you agree with this. And for those of you that are just learning about us, hopefully it gives you reason to talk to us a little more. One is our purpose. We do believe very, very sincerely and passionately, as cliché as it may sound, that our mission as a company and as individuals is to stand between good and evil. And we could talk more about that, but that's how we kind of get up every day and realize that our role as a cybersecurity firm is to really partner with people and help them fight back. And as we think about types of things that are going on in the world and how cybersecurity has changed in the past 2 to 3 years and the attacker profiles, we feel that mission is more important than ever. Our people, as the CEO of the company, I'm extremely proud of the people we have and the standards that we keep. And you can ask any of our team members or those that have attempted to apply and maybe haven't made the grade, that we do have extremely high standards. We have people that come to us from military, the intelligence community, obviously healthcare, high tech, and other areas, but we not only require a high standard to get in, but maintain a high standard once you're in the organization. And our perspective is, I think, somewhat different from what I know of other cybersecurity firms, and that is we don't see ourselves as defenders. No matter what we do, whether it's security operations or it's our software development practices or working with developers on teaching them how to write secure code, or working with FDA or MITRE, we always take an attacker's perspective to what we do. And I think that changes a little bit about how we kind of view the world and why we recommend things the way that we recommend them typically. So that's about us. And really what I want to devote is the rest of this session to talking about how we got here in terms of security operations, some of the myths and fallacies that we've uncovered, some of the things that you may want to know about in terms of, considering your own SOCs. And again, whether you're building or designing it, these things are all applicable. Some of them are funny, some of them are interesting, and some of them are certainly sad. It was certainly eye-opening. And the way that this all occurred was that several years ago, our clients had turned to us and said, you guys should build a SOC. Now, to be very honest, when we started this company, we did not believe that we would be in the SOC business. We didn't see that as one of the things we would want to do. Typically, as attackers, you're not going to go build a SOC. But we kept getting people coming forward and saying, you guys should really think about developing a SOC. And so with that, we decided to start thinking about, well, why are people asking us that question? And what is it that gets people to really think about not wanting to have their SOC? And we had people, just to put this in context, we had a variety of people that talked to us. Some were running their own SOCs and some were using third parties and had 2 to 3 year contracts or had been involved with people for 2 to 3 years as partners. However it is, what we kind of realized was they were recommending us to build out a SOC because they just didn't like what they had. And so that was really the initial germination, if you will, of our research into, well, why don't people like SOCs? Like, what is the issue? I mean, we never really knew that there was a negative side to it. We thought the offerings out there were pretty good. So we spent about 14 months talking to people that own SOCs, whether that was their own or through a commercial third party. We looked at a variety of different SOC platforms, including IBM and SolarWinds and a variety of others. It was a long, exhaustive list. And so we took a look at the technology. We looked at the actual vendors behind the technology, not only those that are producing things like SIMs and correlation engines and all the other stuff, but also looked at people that were MSSPs providing SOC services and started looking at what they are doing and how do they do things. And we also started looking at SOC policies. How are people running their SOCs and what policies and practices are they using? And then we looked at SOC models. What different types of models do you have? And typically it's either a hybrid model where you own it and yet you have an external party who is helping you or taking on some of the responsibility and either coverage or response or something of that nature, or you outsource it completely or you own it completely. And that's typically what we saw, and we call those out and kind of looked at what were the good and the positive behind those things. So we spent a lot of time becoming very familiar with SOCs over this period of 14 months. And again, it was very eye-opening. We really didn't think there would be any reason or need or opportunity to go build out our own SOC. And so as you can imagine, we were kind of surprised at it. I will say that what we ended up, and if we jump to the end of the story, I think what we did learn was the way most SOCs are run, managed, designed, developed, and marketed as a commercial offering or as a privately owned offering was probably not the best way to do it. And a lot of that comes from the fact that we are looking at things from an attacker's perspective. And I'll share more about how we got to those conclusions. But I guess what I would like to say is, I guess the end of the story is we decided to take the path less traveled and not do what everybody else was doing. My hope in this discussion is that if you are considering any kind of a SOC model, that you also take that path less traveled. Again, whether you do it on your own, you do it with us, or you even go do it with a third party, I think our responsibility as being part of this industry is to make sure that you kind of learn from what we learned and we learn from other people's mistakes, and we can share that with you. So here's some fun facts. I don't know how fun they really are, but there's some high level things that we kind of learned. One is that most SOCs have not really evolved. The whole practice of designing, developing, managing, and running SOCs has really not evolved. They've been around for about a dozen years, depending on how you define them, and maybe going back even further than that. But the concept of SOC today and how it's used and viewed has really not evolved. So if you're going to design one, develop one, you really need to push whoever's doing that design and development to really kind of think about not doing it the way it's always been done. Now, there are some standards out there and some things that you can employ, but even those are pretty dated. In fact, we're seeing that even NIST 853 and some of the other standards are getting vastly dated for the current threat landscape. And we always look at things in terms of the current threat landscape. So one of the qualifiers to this statement is that we're thinking of the SOC model versus today's threats. I think, when we go back 10 to 12 years, the way that SOCs were designed and evolved was appropriate for the times. When we have security teams, IT security teams across industries fighting back against, nation states and highly organized attack groups and cyber criminal organizations backed by extremely profitable cyber crime teams, life has changed. And so if you're trying to build out a SOC, you really need to think about, are we still going after script kiddies and university students or even anonymous, or are we now really trying to design a SOC for today's threats? And my hope would be you're designing it for today's threats and tomorrow's. Vastly widely varying degree of understanding as to what a SOC is. And that was an interesting part of our research. We found that different people define it different ways, and we'll talk more about that in the next few slides, but it was we thought a SOC's a SOC, and we realized that's not true. And many times we're big on flexibility and being able to define things to what fits your needs. A SOC is probably one area where you kind of want to hold to a standard and not just define it your own way. And we can talk more about that, or I'll take that as a question later if somebody wants to know why I say that. All too often people look for coolness over substance, and that's occurred even with our SOC. We found that a lot of people got into this, whether they're designing or outsourcing, into it because it looks cool. And everybody has these images of NASA command control centers, and tons of screens on the wall and walls of glass, and just it's cool. And then the software is meant to look cool that runs the SOC or is used by the SOC, with a lot of charts and stuff. And I think a lot of this came from Norse's kind of live attack map. And everybody thought, wow, we're going to have this on the screen and bring in the CEO and show them just how much threats there are out there. And it really looks cool. Unfortunately, when you peel all that away, there's not a lot of substance. And that's probably one of the biggest things we found. And I'll be the first to admit that when we built out our SOC, and this is a big tip for you guys that are going to build your own, we think ours is pretty cool. But more importantly, we spent our money, and we continue to spend our money on our people. And we try to keep and maintain and attract some of the best people we can. And I think that's more important than putting a lot of money into the coolness factor of your SOC. And even if you're going to partner with somebody, don't get fooled by the fact that somebody has spent a ton of money to make something look cool, but yet can't actually execute when the chips are down and you're under attack. So be really careful about that coolness over substance. I call it, function over form, or function over design. Most projects with a SOC do fail. We found that I think it was something about 86% which is not surprising because that's a kind of a standard statistic for most IT projects failing. And when we say fail, it fails on one of several vectors, whether it's the budget, they spent a lot more money than they ever expected to. The vision was not realized as they originally believed it would be. The objectives of the SOC never were met, or the mission. In many cases, we found most SOCs don't have a mission. And so we'll talk about that more later, or their capability. And I think this goes back to coolness. When people first think about SOCs, they kind of think about, again, that NASA command and control thing, and there's going to be attacks and people are going to be doing all this cool stuff. And then when you get into it, you start realizing, wow, that takes a heck of a lot of work and a lot of people, and it starts to fall short. And so I'll talk more about that and ways that you can overcome that and kind of help you with that. And most SOCs, one of the big things we found are about monitoring and not response. Whether it's built or partnered, we found that a lot of the offerings or a lot of the things we looked at were, yeah, they can detect an attack, but that's about it. And so now all of a sudden there is an attack and things start to fall apart, and the SOC was never designed, the team was never enabled or had the capability to actually do response. So I'll talk to you a little more about response in a little bit to kind of highlight what we mean by that. But what I want to do now is kind of talk about each of the major kind of themes that we saw. And so hopefully you can use these as things to not allow this to occur within your organization, depending on what your SOC plans are. One is that whether it was owned or outsourced, the SOC acted as a separate entity. We sometimes saw that the SOC had a very us versus them mentality, which is a major no-no. The SOC really needs to understand the business organization and the business the organization's in. So if you're in banking and you're going to build a SOC, or you're in healthcare, you really need to make sure that SOC understands the business of the organization, understands the terminology, the priorities, the mission objectives of the business, the financials. You really need to know that if you're going to be running and developing a SOC. You also need to understand the culture. Now, some of you may be wondering why. The reason behind that is simply that to integrate the SOC into the organization, the SOC team members need to be able to speak the same language as the rest of the organization. When there is a response or an attack, they need to be able to understand the priority of what's critical to that business and its systems and people. And they need to really, if they're going to provide an oversee or overwatch capability, they need to be able to understand the tolerances and capabilities of the rest of the organization. And if they don't fundamentally understand the business they're in or the culture of that organization, then you're setting yourself up for a situation where it'll look cool and it'll work for a while. But if you get a big attack, you're going to have some big issues. So make sure that you take time to either build out your SOC in a way from a team and culture perspective that they really do understand that business that the SOC is supporting. I don't want to go deeper and deeper into this, but it just does such a foundational piece. And one thing to keep in mind, some people say to us, well, we built our own SOC and yet, they're employees of the company. And yet those employees really don't understand the business, right? They're more focused on the IT and IT security than truly understanding how does sales operate, or if we're in a clinical environment, how do we actually perform care, and what happens in a mass casualty situation, and how does going to a paper environment affect the organization, and what's the SOC's role in those things, and how do we fit into the business continuity plan. And those kind of details where you need to really understand how things work is critical. From a cultural perspective, depending on your line of business, if you're a software vendor, does your chief technology officer have a relationship with the SOC? Because you may be dealing with external attacks that come through the SOC. If you're a hospital, do you have relationships with the chief medical officer and the chief nursing officer and the physical security teams? So a lot of coordination that foundationally you need to kind of have in place. The second thing was this concept of over the wall. We found that a lot of SOCs, and I think this has to do with the first piece, which is they operate as a separate entity. They don't believe that incident response is really their piece of the puzzle. So they will identify an issue and then throw that over the wall to the IT team or to someone else in the organization, and they'll track it and they'll say, hey, they'll check in every once in a while and say, hey, how's it going? But they don't really do anything else. And, they act much more as an advanced help desk that is the ability to watch information going across the wire, but don't really do much else. And that's an issue, because ultimately the rest of the organization will just see the SOC as a help desk and treat them in that vein, which is a bad thing to be doing. So the SOC really has to find a way, like I said earlier, to integrate, but they also need to understand the capabilities of the people that you're giving information to. And if you can do that and help them understand how to take corrective action and kind of set up some standards for how the SOC and the rest of the organization will work, it'll make your life a lot easier, but also make that SOC team much more effective. And the goal here should be that, hey, when something does happen, the SOC team has these really rich relationships with the rest of the organization so that you can all get through it together, versus that us versus them. And the opposite is also true. We have seen, where the IT organization or others in the company, or the healthcare provider, it depends on who you are, have treated the SOC as second-class citizens. And neither one of those things work. You kind of all have the same mission, hopefully, and a shared vision of protecting the organization and the people inside it and the people that you care for. So it should be really unified. And that's a big piece of what has to happen in order to create a very successful SOC program. The next piece is emergency response, and I've kind of teased this a little bit. And that is that we found that a lot of the respondents, a lot of the people that we've worked with in figuring out, well, why don't you like your SOC? Just the SOC had no real incident response capability, and it kind of creates that over-the-wall mentality. Now, when it came to commercial vendors, it was a little bit different. For those that owned the SOC, sometimes they just didn't see the SOC as part of incident response, which is an easy thing to fix and not let happen. But for commercial vendors, if you're outsourcing your SOC, one of the big complaints we found was, hey, when something goes wrong, I call my SOC vendor, and suddenly they're telling me, oh, well, if you want us to help you do anything more than just track the issue, you're going to have to sign another statement of work, or there's an upcharge, or you may have pre-negotiated those charges. And to us, that kind of seems a little bit, I don't know, I don't want to use negative language. I just think it's kind of weird to do that to somebody. So basically what that vendor is saying is, yeah, well, we're going to be there. We're going to help you identify there's an issue, but when the chips are down, we're going to charge you more money, or you're going to have to sign a legal agreement. And that's kind of the exact moment you want them to be your partner, and not be worrying about clocks ticking or charges occurring. So you really need to think about how the SOC is going to play in an emergency response. And given the types of attacks that we have today, it has to be a really fluid kind of relationship. To be realistically totally honest, I don't know how it works where if you have a massive attack going on and you call a vendor and they're telling you, well, we have to get a statement of work run, by the time that conversation occurs, the attack's probably over. So I'm not sure what value that adds. If you have an internal SOC, they need to just be able to respond. And I'll talk more about some models you could use to do that. But the point is, you need to think of the SOC as an overwatch capability. And that's one of the big learnings we had, is that the SOC is not just on the same level as the rest of the organization when it comes to emergency response, but really needs to create kind of a command and control structure. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And one other thing is, the SOC, if something goes on, they're going to have to interact and communicate with senior and executive leadership. And so that's important to keep in mind if you're going to design a SOC and have resources dedicated to it. The worst thing you can start doing is playing telephone, where your SOC team reports to your IT security lead, and the IT security lead talks to the CIO, and the CIO talks to the COO, and the COO then talks to the CEO. That's just a kind of dated model that does not work when you guys are under attack. And we could talk to you about things that we've seen happen in the defense industry and the healthcare industry, where those type of models became part of the reason that things broke down in the incident response. And that turns into monetary fines and all kinds of badness. So another big issue we found was limited value. And I think this goes back to the coolness over substance kind of thing I spoke about earlier. But since most SOCs are only providing monitoring and issue tracking, there's only so much value. And if that's all your SOC's going to do, then my suggestion to you would be is think really hard about how much money you really want to spend on building out that SOC, because there's a bunch of other alternatives that you can probably do that won't require an entire SOC. But if you're going to have somebody watching glass, then hopefully they're doing much more than just monitoring alarms, but they're giving critical feedback. They're trying to kind of coach you and help the rest of the organization develop strategy, and they're providing insights, and they're being proactive, and they're providing intelligence. There's a lot that the SOC should be doing for the amount of money that you typically would invest in either your own or an outsourced SOC. So make sure that not only they're able to do those things, but the SOC team should have an advanced set of skills. They should typically be the most advanced organization that you have within the IT security team. And for a whole bunch of reasons, from the fact that if there's an incident, they need to be able to triage it and help coordinate it. You know, if there's a gap that's identified or a risk, they should be able to articulate it and prioritize that and provide countermeasures to it. And if you're under attack, they should really be able to provide countermeasure guidance and other things to that. They're also going to be interacting with law enforcement and other agencies, so they have a very pivotal role, not to, as I mentioned, your executives. You know, I think one of the things to keep in mind, I'll give you, when I was at Microsoft, one of the things when I worked on the software development teams was that the QA teams always kind of were viewed as, third-rate citizens on the development team. The software engineers were always kind of the coolest ones and always got the most accolades. And so when I was at Microsoft, we worked very hard to switch that model. And what we ended up doing was creating the opportunity for people on the QA team to have the best tools, the best access to education, and eventually that kind of created this opportunity for the most senior and best engineers who would never think of doing QA in their lives to go join the QA teams. And why did we want that? Why did we want our best software engineers on the QA team? Because they were the ones that could do reverse engineering. They're the ones that could spot bugs and figure out how to fix them. They're the ones that could do things that helped us reduce the amount of defects we had and improve our quality. The SOC is very much the same thing. You want to be able to be in a situation where you're attracting the very best people, because you know in the back of your head the reason they're there is to make sure that they don't miss something, that they spot that anomaly, that they see something that the system may have not picked up. And then if something happens, they can help guide you through it. So you want to kind of make it a great, cool place to work and give them the best tools, but also give them the ability to kind of shine in terms of what they contribute day to day. So what's not a SOC? And these are just things I'll throw out there, and some of you may go, oh, you know, Splunk is not a SOC. So I know a lot of organizations who have Splunk, and they call that a SOC. I mean, a SOC is not the tech, right? It's really not your tools or technologies. You could say, well, a SOC will have a SIM, or a SOC will have NIDS, or network intrusion detection, or host intrusion detection, or whatever you're deploying. But just deploying software does not make it a SOC. And hopefully just talking about some of the things we've already talked about, you've already kind of gotten that sense that there is a lot more to it than just deploying some software. And I'm not telling you not to deploy these things. I think Splunk's a really cool tool. Power BI is great. There's a bunch of stuff out there that's awesome. But I think you need to put it into a box and kind of quantify what it is. If you're doing data analytics and looking at what's on your wire and getting some alerts and getting some push notifications, that's great. And that is a very important part of IT security and getting to a data-driven organization for IT security. But be careful to not quantify that as a SOC. The one area you really, really want to be careful in not qualifying something like that as a SOC is if you have cybersecurity liability insurance. And the reason for that is if you are telling your insurers that, oh yeah, we've got a SOC and blah, 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 and yet you know that, hey, you know, we look at our SIM once a month, or we look at it once a week, or we look at it once a day, but we don't really have a SOC team that sits there and is really watching and monitoring and prepared and has the right policies and practices. You're going to be in for a rude awakening if you ever do have an attack and the insurance adjusters come in and start auditing you, because they don't just write a check, right? They're going to come in and they're going to look at your best practices and see where your holes and gaps are. So you want to be careful of that just from your own kind of, I don't want to say job preservation, because I don't think it's that grim, but you want to be careful how you quantify that. And also realize for yourself that there's a lot more to it and do that. One big thing is, you know, a SOC's not a NOC, and the skill sets are vastly different. We have seen a lot of people who use the NOC team as a SOC team. Again, that's great. They're monitoring. They may be watching, you know, screens. They may be getting notifications and calling somebody up and say something happened. That's also all very, very important, but it's not truly a SOC. And so it's just something to kind of keep in mind. So some of the things we've seen them fail, and there's a bunch of reasons for this, which I'll try to articulate each one of these failures, is a large percent of people that reported and we talked to over that 14-month period told us that, their SOC just failed to identify common attacks, that they expected the SOC to pick up on things, and, they just never did. And so there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I will tell you, most of it is not the technology. To some extent it is, and it depends on what tech you're using to monitor your environments. But honestly, a lot of it is the fact that most SOCs are just not set up to really watch and get so familiar with your organization that they understand what an anomaly is, or that communications occurs where things get downgraded and people don't know that, hey, this is more important than it needs to be. And there isn't that relationship. It's us versus them. So every time the SOC calls up and says, hey, we have a problem, the other side of the organization is saying, oh, not them again. I already got 20 things going on. And so a lot of those things around culture and relationships and practice and policy are what contribute to the missing of an attack. And that's an important thing, because I think the first reaction we have as technologists is, oh, the tech sucks. Let's go get some different type of technology. And that's not usually why we're missing attacks. I will tell you, just as a war story, when we go do pen tests, especially when we're doing internal assessments and breaking into people's internal network organizations or wireless, we have yet, in all the pen tests we've done over the past X years, have ever had somebody whose SOC has detected us. And that's kind of a sad thing, because we're attacking and we're not very quiet about it. In fact, we usually start very covertly and get more and more noisy as time goes on. And we've got clients that use all the major vendors, and we always ask, well, did your SOC team notify you? It's one of the things that they should be able to pick up is our presence. And it hasn't. And I think it just has a lot to do with practice and policy. It's not just the tech, is I guess what I'm getting at. You have to have a complementary human process. If you're going to deploy something like this, you need to make sure that if you're doing it on your own, you have the people that are going to be, watching and looking and analyzing, and not just rely on that technology. Your SOC should be able to take a phone call or an email or a meeting and have you describe a set of situations and be able to help you think through, is this truly an anomaly? Are we seeing an attack even though the systems aren't picking it up? That's the real value, right? Because the tech will pick up a lot, but the tech's going to pick up what we know. When it comes to things like zero-day attacks, or potential attacks or fast-moving attacks like WannaCry, you need an organization or someone on your team that's going to be able to analyze that threat intelligence, determine the indicators of compromise, and before signatures are released, begin educating you on what should be done and what you should be thinking about. And that's the kind of timeline we live in today. So just to have the technology is great, and that helps with a lot of it, but you need people who are going to really, truly have the skill set to help you analyze what's happening on your network, or what potentially could happen, and what you need to think about. There's no last line of defense in many of the SOCs that we look at. And in fact, this is why we built our Nightingale product, is because even though we have a SOC and we think we have a great platform, and I completely believe we have awesome people, we also know that not everything's perfect. And so we started realizing as attackers that we could bypass a lot of stuff. And when we do, there is no last line of defense. So we created Nightingale, which is, like I said, a honeypot, to kind of be that last line of defense. The message I want, hopefully, for you to take away here is that you need a last line of defense. If you have a SOC, or if you don't, whatever you're kind of where you are in the maturity curve of cybersecurity operations, think about, what is my last line of defense? How do I have in place that if everything were to fail, I have something that I hopefully can rely on? And what if that thing fails? But Sensato Nightingale was meant to be that. And we found that, especially from our pen testing activities, many of the SOCs just don't have last lines of defense. And then, one other big area is organizations investing more in in technology rather, than in training and testing. And that should be inverted. If you're going to invest, if you're going to develop a budget for your SOC and you're building out your own, make sure that you put more money into training your team and testing the organization, the SOC, than in the technology, or on an overall basis, and especially on an ongoing basis, because the training that you give your team is going to pay huge dividends when and if something were to happen to you. And a lot of times people just buy the tech, they don't train on it, so the team never becomes good at it or great at it. In this case, is what we need. And then they get frustrated with the tech, and we get back into that cycle of, oh, let's go find something new. And that's not a good practice. So planning your SOC, what are some things you should really be thinking about in terms of planning? And this is kind of what I'm going to take you through here is going to be more of the soft side. But what I would urge you to do is to think about these things, because they all come from the stuff that we've learned over that 14 months. And regardless of how you do it or if you're going to do it, these are things to be aware of. One is define a mission for that SOC. And the reason for that is it rallies your team, it creates focus, and it creates boundaries for you. And if your SOC team doesn't have, a reason to rally and be passionate, they're eventually going to get burnt out or tired or not feel worthy. And you certainly need them to focus and understand why they're coming to work every day. And lastly, they need to understand the boundaries of their capabilities, right? And that mission is going to kind of set those capabilities. This is a really important one, and that is you need to know what is the capabilities of your SOC. And I tell that whenever I'm teaching classes, I say this about any IT security team, like, what are your capabilities? Like, what can you and can't you do? Can you do forensics? I run into a lot of teams and I go, yeah, we do forensics. And we have a conversation about it. And I'm like, well, you don't really do forensics. You kind of just have read about forensics. The same thing applies to SOCs. If you're going to do this, then know what services you're going to provide. And it's very, if you're building your own, then you should do it just as if you were doing a commercial startup. Think about what is it you're going to market to your executive team and to your colleagues and to the rest of the organization, that this is what our SOC is going to be capable of doing. These are the services that we're going to provide. If you're looking at a third party to go build a SOC or design one with you, then you should be really articulate about what services do you need from them, to what level of services and what capabilities. So you don't have a surprise down the road. You don't want a CEO or somebody in your organization going, well, why did we invest all this money? I thought these people could do that. I thought they could help with this. And you'd be surprised some of the things the CEO is expecting when they're investing in a SOC. And again, this goes back to making sure you articulate what you have versus what you think you have. And then the budget. One of the big areas we see people get into is just they don't realize how expensive it is to do all this. So I think, however you're going to do this, make sure the budget is able to afford you the ability to achieve your mission and to provide those services and capabilities. And then the one area that everybody kind of hates and is the driest area of all, and probably not the most fun, is your policies. And we're not talking about HIPAA policies here, right? We're talking about, a whole bunch of stuff around how do you manage, anomalies, and what is your inclement weather going to be, and what happens, are they defined as essential personnel to the organization, and all kinds of stuff that has to do with just running the SOC day to day and maintaining the services and capabilities that you've advertised to everybody. You don't want to be in a situation where you go, yeah, we're good to go, except on these days, right? Because that doesn't do anything for anyone. If you've signed up for 24/7, and that's what you're telling everybody you're going to do, then you really need to think about how you're going to do that and what level of standard. And it may seem pretty straightforward, but I can tell you, if you put time into this, you'll be far ahead of a lot of the people that we spoke to, because a lot of them did not do this, and they ended up afterwards realizing they should have. But mostly they just said, hey, we're going to go build a SOC, and they just had some conversations, and they just went out and hired somebody or built it and ordered some licenses for Splunk or something else. And they then realized, oh, wow, this is a lot more complicated and consuming than we thought. We believe there are a couple SOC models, and this is our terminology. One is the traditional model, which is kind of what we've seen and most people are familiar with. And then we kind of started this concept of SOC 2.0. And it's just our term. I don't know if there's really a SOC 2.0, but we kind of think there should be. If there isn't, and if there is, then we'll change our terminology, because we probably don't agree on what SOC 2.0 is. But for us, SOC 2.0 is very much based on the military concept of a tactical operations center, or a TOC. If you have a military background, the concept of a TOC should be very familiar with you. If you don't have a military background and you don't know what a TOC is, and you're going to build out a SOC, I would implore you to go out and just do a little bit of reading on TOCs and their role in military command and control and how they work, because I think that's a really strong and powerful model for a SOC. And so we adopted that, and I would urge you to adopt that. So we kind of, in this case, are departing from this traditional SOC mentality and really thinking of things more in terms of tactics and capability and responsiveness. And the TOC model does address a lot of the myths that you would typically, that we've kind of talked about. And there's kind of 4 areas that you need to think about when you're setting up a TOC. And that is the intelligence, right? So in the military world, you can't have a tactical operations center. You can't provide overwatch to troops on the ground if you don't have very strong intelligence. And this is usually a big thing that most people miss. They deploy their tech, they deploy some people, and then ultimately they don't have any intelligence. So they just can react to what they see, but they can't be predictive and they can't prepare the organization for some sort of a response or proactive state. The SOC definitely needs to think through continuous diagnostics. And this is actually a best practice we're seeing rapidly evolve in the defense sector. And it's not as hard as you may think, but if you're in healthcare or you're in some kind of critical infrastructure organization like finance, one way to think of continuous diagnostics is the collection of information related to anomalies. And so, for example, if you have medical devices, and suddenly the shift, your nursing is contacting your medical engineering group and telling them that, they're rebooting these smart pumps every 2 hours. You don't want the medical engineering group to just say, hey, that's fine, we'll look at it in the morning. Somebody needs to identify that anomaly to the SOC, because that's not something a SIM or something else is going to pick up. But yet your SOC needs to kind of think about the fact that, hey, we're in the business of continuous diagnostics. We want to know about the anomalies in our organization. And I think that kind of an example also kind of teases out and illustrates the working relationship the SOC has to have with the rest of the organization. So it's a really important piece that you have continuous intelligence and continuous diagnostics. And then lastly is the piece that most of us are familiar with, which is continuous monitoring. The one thing I will tell you about continuous monitoring is that we typically see that as a very basic definition, like, oh, I'm going to deploy a SIM, I'm going to deploy some NIDs and HIDs. But there's more to it than that, right? The SOC should be running vulnerability assessments internally for you. The SOC should be looking at social media. The SOC should be looking at dark web. The SOC should be doing kind of, social open source intelligence reviews, because their job is not to just look at what's on the network, it's to protect the entire organization. And if suddenly you're doing an open source intelligence review and information's popping up about your network infrastructure, or you find a network diagram somewhere, then it's probably an interesting piece of information that needs to be thought of as intelligence, and you need to start thinking about, have we been compromised or have we not? And my hope in illustrating that to you is that the SOC needs to be more than just watching glass. They need to be proactive and go out and look for those indicators of compromise, not just wait for the alarm to go off. And then lastly is command and control. Right, in the TOC model versus the SOC model, this concept of a tactical operations center, we're also adding in, or I'm urging that you add in, the command and control. So when something goes wrong, that TOC, if you will, can help, guide what is going to happen during a response. And I'll give you some more ideas on that. But the idea is that's where we came up with this concept of CTOC. And our hope is that other people follow that model. Again, whether you do it on your own, partner with somebody, go choose a third party, the hope is to evolve the state of the industry when it comes to security operations and kind of get to a new level. And we think the CTOC is a much, much better model. And the roots, like I said, come out of the military. So the CTOC has a bunch of stuff built into it when we talk about it and think about it, to help kind of deal with a lot of the myths, right? An integrated mission, advanced technology, threat intelligence, we talked about proactive capability, going out and looking for those indicators, an incident response platform, something goes wrong, they're able to, kind of be the lead organization on the response, the ability to coach and guide others. You don't have that us versus them mentality and just throw things over the wall, but they have a skill set that people look to and go, hey, can you help me with this? Can you help guide me? They're not a partner, they're a team member, right? They're part of the overall organization. They have integration with state and federal agencies. This is an important one. If you're going to build your own SOC or you're going to use somebody else, make sure that the SOC knows how to get a hold of the FBI or the Secret Service, depending on the type of attack. And some of you are probably going, what do you mean on the type of attack? depending on the type of attack, you're going to call either Secret Service or FBI. It's not going to be either. You can call either one and they'll direct you the other way if you need to. But to me, if I'm running a SOC or a CTOC, I think I'd want my SOC to know who they're supposed to call when and have existing relationships with those federal agencies. There should be an overwatch capability, meaning that the SOC is never going to be on the ground responding to and fixing servers and rebooting machines or applying patches, but they should be kind of in that bunker mode where they can be answering the phone. And if somebody calls and says, hey, we need help from VMware, or we need you to get Microsoft on the line, the SOC can do that while still monitoring and being proactive, right? So the SOC needs to, in this model, in the CTOC model, they need to be able to they need to be able to facilitate and provide overwatch while people on the ground are facilitating a response. The playbook is really important, and that is really the cornerstone of a CTOC, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then kind of understanding the on-the-ground mission, right? Which means that if you have other resources, like your network engineers, your system admins, or your business continuity team or compliance, the SOC understands who is involved in what area of a response, and also what their capabilities are, because the SOC needs to kind of be the glue that keeps everything kind of connected. And then this critical support capability is kind of an extra, but if you're going to kind of amp things up and take things to a new level when it comes to designing and developing and evolving a SOC, my suggestion, and one of the things we look at, is what else can the SOC do when it comes to a crisis? And the SOC should be able to help no matter what's going on. So if somebody's like, hey, we're diverting patients because you're in a hospital environment, the SOC should be aware of that and be able to say, do you need us to help with anything? Is there any phone calls we can do for you? Is there anything we can do to help? Because the SOC should ultimately be really masters of crisis management. And so they should be relied on to do more than just, hey, the cybersecurity stuff. And again, that's a personal kind of thing you can decide, but it, to me, would be you have all this money invested in a team, and they're really good, hopefully, at doing incident response and crisis management and anomaly detection and technology and coaching and guiding. And so if it was me, I would really, think about what else they can do beyond that. Some advice, if you have a SOC or if you're going to build one, two things that come out of kind of the myths and fallacies we've seen: test your SOC, run drills, and run them in coordination. It's okay to surprise the SOC and do a drill, but you should also run them holistically, meaning, okay, we're going to do a drill. We're going to see if the SOC detects it, and then we're going to have them notify, the downstream organizations, and we're going to see how they respond. And we're going to kind of find out, like, does this all work? And do that over and over. Red team exercises, and I say or not here because a lot of organizations aren't really ready to do a red team. But if you're going to do pen testing, then for sure make certain that your SOC detected the pen test, right? They shouldn't be aware of it's happening unless you have some very clear objectives as to why they need to know. But the SOC should not know, and then they should be able to say, hey, yeah, we see a brute force attack occurring, or we've seen this or that. Obviously, tabletop simulations is another good way. And then if you think you're up for it, go to the cyber range. We'd be happy to have people and host you and bring you in and see how you make out in a real situation. The second thing I would really advise you of is just be brutally honest about what your SOC can do, knowing the limits, the services you're providing, as we talked about, know your people and how good they really are and where they need help in evolving their skill sets, and know the technology. And again, this is all whether or not you are going to build it yourself or have it yourself, or you have a third party or some hybrid of those models. And then, so that brings us to kind of how everything we took to build a CTOC and our CTOC, our operations center. And I'm not going to go deep into that because I promised I'm not going to use this as a marketing event. I really hope that you take the information here and it helps you even a little bit. But I do want to have one quick word on incident response, even though this isn't kind of a webinar on that. We're going to do a webinar in a few weeks on incident response and some of the fallacies and things we found there and how we're recommending that change. But make sure that if you have a SOC, or even if you don't, you have a really strong incident response platform, not a plan. Given the attacks we're seeing, and when we look at attacks and we work with organizations and the response to those attacks, we're seeing that, I would tell you, probably 10 out of 10 of the organizations we see, whether we work with them or somebody else in the industry works with them, the findings are the same. The organizations had incident response plans, and they're just not up to snuff. They just can't deal with the types of attacks we see today. They're still kind of like the SOCs are, thinking about things the way they were 10 to 12 years ago. So you need to get an incident response platform. And that means that as a platform, it can evolve and scale, and there's a different way to look at it versus a plan. Plans are very cumbersome, not agile in most cases, and really based on a 1980s approach to kind of, project management, which doesn't work well with what we're dealing with today as cybersecurity professionals. So basically they're outdated and they can't move very quickly. If you're going to put together a program or a platform for incident response, put in place things like protocols, standing orders, immediate action drills, and have a unit one. Protocol standing orders come out of the world of trauma surgery and emergency medicine. And when we do our incident response stuff, that's where we take it from. You need to kind of think about that. Immediate action drills come out of the special operations world. And unit one is just this idea that any given time, there is somebody in the organization who could be called and they can make the decisions required in the event of an emergency. And it's not a chain of command, or it's not a call chain. So your SOC should be able to call a unit one and say, listen, we saw this, it's a bad attack, it's moving quickly. We've got 3 or 4 minutes to decide if we're going to shut everything down and go to paper or disconnect an air gap. What do you want to do? And that unit one needs to be accessible. And in the pace of the attacks we see today, you need to have a unit one. You cannot, one thing I will tell you, if you have an incident response plan and there's a call list and you got to call somebody who's going to call somebody who's going to call somebody, don't bother calling, because by the time you get to that last person, the attack's over. If the nuance attack took 14 minutes, and in those 14 minutes, close to 23,000 servers were compromised, 14,000 of which were completely destroyed. So that's the kind of attacks we're dealing with today. I know you guys know that because we're all in the same industry, but I'm trying to give you some fodder and some information so you can go back and fight the good fight. Keep in mind that in incident response, even if you have a SOC, your IT help desk is going to be your first responders. And in many cases, the SOC is going to work with the IT help desk to kind of either take action or understand what's happening. And so really important that those two groups kind of work very well together and understand their roles. And typically you don't want them to be the same people, right? Because that would be kind of a really hard way to do it in a way that you really get the value out of the SOC that you hopefully want. And then, we've talked about testing your plan. So not just testing the SOC, but if you have an IR plan, test it through some form of simulation. I think that's pretty much everything I have for you guys today. Hopefully you got something out of it. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. I think there's a chat window, or you can raise your hands in the participant window. Let me just try to figure out how to get that to work on my side. But if not, I truly appreciate your time, but we'll give it a few minutes just if anybody has any questions or anything you'd like to ask. And just remember you're muted, so I think you can unmute yourself. If not, I will unmute everybody and you guys can ask away.
John, you emphasize people as a centerpiece here. What professional attributes are we looking for in the people that man the SOC? And can you talk a little bit more about ongoing training that they need to stay current?
Yeah, and that's a great question because that's probably the hardest thing to get right is the people. And I think there's two sides to this. And, frankly, we've seen this on our side where I think people romanticize the SOC, right? Whether it's whatever role you're playing, everybody kind of romanticizes it. Because, if you look on Google, there's some cool images and you think you're going to be kind of doing a lot of cool stuff. And, I think the first trait that you need is somebody who realistically understands what is the job. And the job, can be extremely cool, but it's like a firefighter. And that's kind of what I tell my team is, we need you to be firefighters. You got to be always diligent. You're always kind of training. You need to be cross-functional because one moment you're responding to a car accident, the next you're getting a cat out of the tree, and the next time you're going into a burning building. And so cybersecurity is kind of like that, right? Sometimes we're dealing with, an internal threat and it's, an employee versus a full-blown phishing attack versus ransomware. And we need people that can understand those and the incidents and keep their head. So one is understanding the reality of the job. There's going to be a lot of boredom interspread with a lot of levels of high stress. They need to be able to stay cool, so some of those softer skills and those emotional capabilities. They definitely have to have a leadership presence or some form of ability to have a command presence, if you will, because they're going to be asked, right? And one thing I didn't mention in the slides, you got to think about, like, if something ever goes to court, right? If there's ever a patient safety issue, if you're in healthcare, or if there's a material breach in finance, there's a good chance your SOC team is going to be deposed. So when you're thinking to your people, one good thing I use is this somebody you would put in front of an attorney? Because if not, and they're going to melt down, they're probably not the right person for a SOC. And then there's the technical skills, right? And they definitely need to be cross-functional. But of all the skills, I typically prefer to hire people who understand the job, are smart self-learners, because the technical skills we can evolve over time. And those technical skills, I would, they definitely, whatever tools you're going to employ, they need to really know those really masterfully. And that means they're probably going to have to learn some Python and some other stuff, regardless of the tool. And then the other piece of that is the incident response capability, the ability to respond from an incident and really drive, I wouldn't say lead, but at least be part of an incident response team, because they're going to be in the center of it and they need to be contributors to that. Hopefully that helps. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's a great question and it's really hard to answer in a few seconds. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think we've done a full hour. Hopefully you found this, somewhat valuable. I really appreciate it if you either got back to me and just say, hey, that was good, or it sucked, or let Amanda Garrett, who put this together for us, and I truly appreciate all the work she did. And she's amanda.garrett@sensato.co, and you could let her know as well, or let her what your thoughts were. Truly appreciate it. So thank you guys. Hope you found this valuable. We will